Okay, looks like we can go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome for joining us tonight on our webinar on a step-to-step guide for the medical school application process. We're so excited to have you all here with us tonight. I hope that we can provide you with some actionable tips on how you can succeed and stand out just throughout this entire process. First, we're going to get started with some introductions. So my name is Grace Kennedy, and I'm a graduate coach / progress manager at Ingenious Prep. I am originally from Southern California in Newport Beach to be exact. I graduated from Stanford with my BA in Science, Technology, and Society. There I played on the varsity volleyball team for a couple of years. And then I also was a peer mentor for my major where I help students navigate throughout the college process. I'm super excited to be here tonight with Philip. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Philip. My name is Philip Kim. I'm currently a surgical resident, but I graduated from Harvard Med School and Business School in 2015 with an MD and MBA, the joint degree program, which is pretty popular these days. During my time at Harvard, I also worked at the admissions office. They recruit about a dozen students every year, so we read applications on a weekly basis, and I did about 55 interviews that are formal interviews, equal weight to professor interviews. And learn a lot, not only through going through the process of applying to medical school, but also being on the other side. So I thought I'd be able to help. So
great, thank you.
Help out. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So here's an outline of what we're going to cover today. First, I'm just going to go through very quickly some introductions, who we are, and what we do at Ingenious Prep. So at Ingenious Prep, we have over 150 former admissions officers and over 75 graduate coaches. Former admissions officers are people like Philip who actually made admissions decisions and ultimately decided whether a student gets into their medical school or not. Whereas a graduate coach is someone who graduated from a top university, also went to medical school, but they're a trained writer and editor. So they help on more of a strategic level in terms of editing personal statements and that type of stuff. We've really worked hard to build up our curriculum in order to provide our students very objective insights from these specific schools. So our former admissions officers come from a range of top schools like Harvard, UCSF, Cornell, etc. So they are able to provide our students with very school-specific insight. We also have a lot of different resources, top university professors who work with our students to provide them academic mentorships. We are a really fast-growing company, and of course, we help students with internships if they need that as well. And all of this also has led to some pretty great results, but I'll get into those in more detail later on through the presentation. So here's a closer look at some of our counselors. We have some of our former admissions officers on the top row. So we have Emily from Harvard, Philip, who's here with us tonight, Chantal from UCSF, and same with Milana. And then down below is a look at some of our graduate coaches. So we have Sergio, who went to Baylor for his MD, Gabby, who went to Miami, and Manny, who went to Yale, and some more as well. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it off to Philip, who's basically going to do the rest of the presentation, and he's going to talk through how applications are actually processed and evaluated in the medical school admissions office.
So yeah, to start with, as many of you know, less than 50% of all applicants get accepted to medical school. There's a very well-established process how this all happens. This is sort of the stats of top medical schools, the acceptance rate. Just because one has a lower or higher acceptance rate doesn't necessarily mean one's a better school, because it all depends how many people apply. So I know BU has a 1%, Boston University has like a 1% acceptance rate when I was applying, and it also, some schools can be harder than others, but they're pretty low, and usually 1 to 5% for the U.S. medical schools here, as you can see here. So one true or false to go over it. Schools have an algorithm to determine who is accepted or rejected.
And you can write the answer, what you think true or false, in the chat box also. It looks like we have everyone thinking false. And
so yeah, as most of you already know, artificial intelligence isn't as good yet, so we don't have that process. We all use a process called holistic review for most medical schools, where admissions officers assess every part of the application. So I'm just going to briefly go over how applications are reviewed in the admissions office. I know that's the number one question people ask me, what happens behind the scenes? So this is, well, it's slightly different medical school to medical school. In general, we'll go over what happens behind after you submit your application. So once you submit your application, which is everything, the primary and the secondary, which we'll go into further detail, the top schools, your application goes through some sort of pre-screening process. That is very different for every medical school. But once you're screened and you're selected, then the applications are separated so that admissions officers like myself will get a pile of applications every week, meant to read them and go over them so that we'll be able to interview them. So then the interviewees get selected. Then they come to the medical school, do it in-person interviews, usually at least 2, if not 3. And then we all meet usually on a weekly or bi-weekly basis to not only read the interviewee reports, like how was the interview, what score am I giving this interviewee, but also reread the application in context. And the admissions committee member who read your application, sometimes it's usually 2 or if not 3, then sort of report what we think is best, acceptance, rejection, or continued sort of look at what your application further. So sort of priorities of what we do, admissions officers, obviously we all do it because we want good fellow doctors to be in the field. Even when I'm a patient, I want my doctor to be kind and nice. So obviously you want to find strong leaders, good classmates, committed students, and compassionate providers, and really just kind people. I like to emphasize that, kind and humble people. And some things that for sure we do not like to see, although this is pretty broad, is people who are not sure about medicine and just want to try it out and throw in their hat in the game. Possible dropouts, really unkind, unethical behaviors that we see. Sort of red flags that are common sense to things that you wouldn't want your doctor to have. And and obviously if people that you want to be able to work with these people for 80 hours a week, so that we do during residency. So that's a big part of what we see to try to pick who is going to become a doctor. So the takeaway here is that you do have to make an impression on your admissions officer at the end of the day. When I say impression, I mean a good impression, not a really bad impression. Otherwise, the admissions officer will not advocate for you, and it's really hard to be admitted to any medical school. So as you know, we often say there's no safety U.S. medical school, so to speak. So now we're going to details with the primary and the secondary application, and then the interview, which is the 3 parts to complete the marathon of applying to medical school. So the primary application is called the AMCAS, and the basics of this is that you submit this through their AMCAS service online. It opens for submission typically at the end of May or beginning of June. All the information that you input in the AMCAS will be sent to almost all MD programs at this. And this is sort of a snapshot what it kind of looks like, which we'll go further into detail. It starts with demographics. It also has works and activities, the personal statement, etc., and your grades, transcripts, and letters of rec eventually. So when should I submit my primary application? This one's an easy answer, but as soon as possible. So most people say the first date it's available. Hopefully the website doesn't crash as it has sometimes in the past, I think. But you want to have your application a complete, proofread, confident, and ready to go when it's open. The more and more you delay the application, the more and more it could affect your chances. And being on the admissions committee side, I didn't appreciate this when I was an applicant because I was kind of middle to late to the game at times. But being early can offer a huge advantage by getting things in early, because you're seen faster, you're more likely going to interview early on. So I can't emphasize this enough. So the components of the MCAS applications that I sort of mentioned, you need your transcript, your MCAT score that it's unexpired, your activities and experiences section, which we'll go into further detail. The personal statement, which is a big one, that most people are stressed out about, and then letters of recommendation. So transcript and MCAT score. So this is really, I think, a helpful thing for a lot of people to know is that unlike many things that you've done in the past, GPA and MCAT alone are not everything. And really, I would like to emphasize that it's really a threshold matter. So it's all about combining the two, also almost equal weight, so to speak, and then seeing if you would fit the threshold effect of being able to be qualified to enter a U.S. medical school. So there's clearly there are scores that really make it difficult for you to be above that threshold, to be above that bar, which if that's the case, sometimes you will be screened out, unfortunately, before even being offered an interview. But most, I would say a large portion of people, majority of people will fit the threshold. And the goal is to fit that threshold so that you're in the ball game, you're being screened, you're being looked at, you may get an interview and onboard and be accepted. So that's the goal. And it's GPA and MCAT are both equally important. Though another caveat to this is once you're in the threshold, it doesn't mean that a good GPA and a perfect MCAT is going to get you in no matter what. I've rejected many perfect GPA and MCAT students, unfortunately, because everything else was not much to see. So it's really a threshold effect. Once you got that down, you still have to care about everything else almost equally, I would say.
Philip, I'm just going to interject real quick.
Sure.
What would you say, because we get this question a lot, is like the threshold? Does it depend on the school, or is it just like a number?
That's it's like $1 million question. But what I often ask people is every at least most U.S. colleges have a published GPA of their accepted pre-med students. Mm-hmm. So I would try to at least meet that or not be too far away from that. Mm-hmm. So like say my school was a 3.6 average of students who got accepted to medical school, or 3.5. So that was a ballpark for my college, but it may depend on the college. Your college may give worse grades for everyone. Mm-hmm. In that case, maybe it'll be a 3.3 or 3.4, but that's sort of the idea. And I don't think anyone really publishes MCAT, although medical schools like to publish their average MCAT scores. So you can look at those to sort of gain an idea. Do I at least meet the average? Am I really far away from the average of accepted students? Because if you're like multiple standard deviations away from it, it may make it harder for you. But it really is school to school dependent as well. So.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So takeaway, great GPAs and test scores are not enough to guarantee admission. I can't emphasize this enough. While it's great if you got a perfect GPA and perfect test score, you cannot find security in that. And that alone, while you should feel good about it, shouldn't be the reason that you think you'll get in. So there are many other factors that we need to go over. So the next part is activities and experiences section. It hasn't changed since many, many years. So it's still 15 spaces for quote unquote relevant work, research, internships, or other extracurricular activities. You're allowed to put 3 most meaningful experiences to like highlight the most important part that you think has to be seen by an admissions committee member. These are the 3 things that they have to know about me. You get about 700 characters for each description. Every character counts, and then 1,300 characters or so for the 3 most meaningful activities. So the format that you'll see when you get your MCAS application, it's by section, so it'll go over experience type. So either it's community service, leadership, research, volunteering, hobby, sports, etc., awards. So everything can have its own experience type. And then you talk about the name. Try to avoid acronyms, because especially acronyms we don't know. Spell it out first time, always. The dates that you worked in, they always ask you like how long, how frequently, how many hours each week, etc. So you kind of get an idea if this was like a 5-day stint or a 5-year stint. That kind of changes things. We'll always have a contact name and title, contact email and phone, the organization name, and then most importantly, the most important 2 things will be the experience description and the most meaningful experience remarks for the top 3. The experience description often is in like paragraph format, although some people do use bullet format and it does work, but I would say majority of time people write kind of like a mini essay for it. And a lot of these, you really still want to write them like stories, not like a resume. If I just see like a bunch of bullets saying this is what I did, it's not really that meaningful. So try to think about these, each one as like a kind of a mini essay assignment to write your story and almost describe what you did in more personal matters. So goals for students, as you write these things, obviously there's no perfect formula for everyone. Some people may have 9 volunteering activities that define who you are. Some people may have 9 nature publications that define who you are. But et cetera, whatever it is, you want to be able to show the leadership that you've achieved, what are the achievements that you've gained, and what involvements have you shown to really show that you're passionate about something instead of this is sort of a thing I tried out and it was fun. Some things to avoid. These are kind of no-brainers, but I do see them unfortunately pretty frequently. So a lot of people like to write their high school stuff, unless it was like you won the U.S. Olympiad gold medal. I don't know if you can do that in high school, but like unless it's something major, I would shy away from high school accomplishments. Although, and including activity you can't speak about. This is a very common mistake that people do. Like for instance, even for me, I almost wrote my high school research experience in cancer research. But then someone told me when I was writing my application, like, Phil, are you going to be able to talk about that? And I was like, no, I have no idea what like the pathway that I was using. So in that case, you really almost want to think about excluding things that you really don't want to talk, you can't talk about well, or you don't want to talk about well. Obviously, if it's a major portion of your life, you can't exclude it because it'll raise flags. But if it's something like in high school or something that you did like like briefly during a semester, don't write things that you can't talk about. Is sort of a big caveat that I want to tell people. Don't repeat yourself in the descriptions. Try to keep track of how many I's you write, because sometimes it's like I's. The I's can add up too much, so try to keep it focused on the actual activity. Don't include too many future activities or publications that are, we are hoping to do this, we're hoping to do this, because we only really care about what have you actually done. And most importantly, really, you should proofread this. I know it's important to submit things early, but it's almost worse to submit early with that's not good enough. So you want to make sure it's ready, proofread, ideally by someone else other than yourself, to make sure there's no grammatical errors and be able to submit it on time. Personal statement. So this is one I know that it causes probably most anxiety to most people. I know it definitely, I still remember the anxiety it provoked to me. It still hasn't changed to 5,300 characters. Most people can remember this 10 years afterwards, how many characters you have to write. So it's really one page, single space is how you can think about it. And you have, every person who reads your application will read your personal statement. Every interviewer will read your personal statement. So it's one thing that everyone will see. Some people may skim over your activities, but you will not skim over your personal statement. So this really is important. I can't emphasize that enough. So the most two important goals of the personal statement that I like to say is the first two that are here. So A, show who you are, not your mom, not your dog, not your professor who you work with, but really who you are, and show why medicine. And the key here is show, not tell. So you can say, I want to do medicine because I like helping people. That's telling. You haven't shown me anything why you want to do medicine. So really think about showing these two together. And it's a really tricky thing to do in one essay, to show not only what character you are, but why medicine is so important to be you. And like, for instance, if you say like, I really want to become a doctor because I like social work, then I'm going to ask you, why aren't you a social worker instead? So you got to think about these questions a little bit. And then the other things that are important are less important, but still important to keep in mind are showing the passion for a field of medicine. That should come as you say why medicine. Show your qualifications, show your personality. Don't be afraid to really be genuine. It's a personal essay, not like a platonic resume. This can be really personal. People talk about like family deaths. People can talk about like family events, personal events. Obviously, you want to filter it to a certain level, but it can be very vulnerable. So keep that in mind. As much as it can show who you are, that's the best. And lastly, it should show the theme of how your application fits together. And don't tell is a big portion. Try to think of stories instead of telling. Sometimes the worst personal statements are ones that just have a bunch of truisms, like medicine is supposed to be for a field of honorable people. Like it doesn't say anything about who you are. So try to really think about how to make this geared to who you are. So last basically takeaways, you have one page to impress us. We often, they often say that there's a good pile and a bad pile. Try to be in the good pile when someone reads your personal statement. But at the same time, there is some judgment with your writing skills, communication skills, how well you can tell your story, because it kind of gives an idea of how well you would be at the bedside of a patient, so to speak, and at the interview. So this is important. The Holy Trinity. So yeah, the holy trinity, I guess, for the personal statement to summarize is you, your passion for medicine, and your reason why medicine, which is a unique answer for everyone. It should really come, your experiences should make it seem like it makes sense that you want to do medicine. And then your qualifications as someone who wants to become a physician. All those three are part of your application to show us. Another things, so it has to be about you, as I mentioned. It's surprisingly a common mistake people do. If you look at your essay and you say, wow, like 60% of it is about the person I shadowed, it's not really about you. So you try to always write a statement and then think about how much am I focusing on someone else versus myself? Because at the end of the day, we want to see your thoughts, your reflections. It could be like a memoir. It could be about experiences. There are many creative ways to go about this. There's no perfect format, but do what's best for you. Number two, it should make your whole application kind of come together. Ideally, there's a theme, like either a theme of service, theme of helping, those that less in need, a theme of doing research to help millions, etc. Like there has to be a sort of a theme that distinguishes you, that really would help you. And then make sure the personal statement can be summed up the way you want it to be. And I often tell people, try to start the personal statement interesting. If you lose the reader at the beginning of the personal statement, it's kind of tough because we often have not that much time to read the whole thing. So I often say it's kind of nice if you can draw the reader's attention early on with an interesting story or something that draws their attention right away. That's ideal because you can have a perfect personal statement that's really boring, and that's not that great either. Lastly, the essay should really, I should have no question if I read your essay that you want to do medicine. And I know that's really hard to do. And people always ask me, like, how do you do that? Like, how do I not sound cliche? The real way I can answer that is you have to really do some soul searching about why am I becoming a doctor? If the reason is because my parents are doctors and it seems like a great job and I'm going to do it, like, you got to think about that again. You got to really think about, you're committing yourselves for like at least 7 to 10 years of training. Is this really the right decision for you? Is this really the best thing? Do you think this is the best field? Like, why not nursing? Why not dentistry? Why not physical therapy? Like, there's so many other things, even related to medicine, that you can do. So you really have to think about, like, why is this the best option for me? And the more soul searching you do, the better you'll be prepared to answer this question. And that is most you, not someone else's carbon copied answer. So, and we can often tell when you're faking it. And that's sort of the whole point of the interview and the personal statement. And we really should demonstrate the maturity of what you thought about this, and also prove to us that you've put in time to do the experiences to know about medicine. If you want to do medicine and you've never seen a patient or a doctor interact, that kind of speaks bad on what you're saying, because you've never seen medicine in action, and yet you want to join the field, which, like, in any field, that makes no sense. You want to be a mechanic, you got to at least see a mechanic touch a car. So it's sort of the same idea, if that makes sense. And then qualifications as a future physician. Obviously, we want keep it positive. We should focus on your qualifications. While humility is great, I think there's also a mistake of people either are too humble, as in like they don't want to write anything that they did well, which like we want you to sell yourself, like tell us what you did well. But the other opposite thing that people do wrong is also the fact that sometimes they go all the way and then say, like, this is why I deserve to be a doctor. This is why I deserve to get into your medical school. I deserve all this. And then that kind of rubs us the wrong way. Like, this guy is kind of cocky or condescending. Like a balance of humility at the same and confidence at the same time. And that, those can be red flags in there, if that makes sense. These are some a laundry list of things that can be shown during a personal statement. As I said, there's no perfect formula. Someone's essay could be all about leadership. Someone's could be all about communication or compassion. It could be about resilience, depending on your life story. I've read some personal statements that were like just completely inspiring. That's the goal. But if you're not there, at least be the one that says, "Oh, I like reading this. I'm excited to meet this guy." At the end of the day, we want you want the person to read your essay and be like, oh, I really want to talk more about this guy, to learn more why he wants to be a doctor, and that's the goal. So. Other mistakes. So as you've known, there are more common mistakes that are easily avoidable than there are many ways to succeed, very few ways to fail. So I think it's helpful to know the few ways to fail to make sure that you succeed. So common mistakes are rewriting your resume, exaggerating adversity, really using that diversity section in the wrong way. As I said, try to leave high school in the past. As much as you like to hang on to that President's Award of volunteering. You're not a doctor yet. Please don't act like you are. This is something that does happen pretty frequently and definitely rubs us the wrong way. And it's unfortunate because I feel like most writers didn't intend on it, but they write it such so that it rubs us the wrong way. And also, you're not a philosopher. Don't criticize other professions. Don't be negative. Don't write politically incorrect stuff. Don't use racial slurs, which I've seen. So try to avoid all the unprofessional stuff altogether, which is a no-brainer. Injured athlete, international sojourn or tropical vacation, mental illness, etc. Some of these are pretty common sense. So. Letters of recommendation. So this is the last component of the primary application. So this is the part I feel like most people underrate because it's also the only part that you cannot fully control. But that being said, there are things you can do to maximize your chances of having a good letters of recommendation. I always say the person who knows you best is always usually better for you. So try to find someone who knows you well, who you are. Also, there's going to be letters of who shows how smart you are, how well you did in school. But don't let all 5 letters be a cookie cutter letter. You don't want all 5 letters to say this guy got A's in classes. You want all 5 letters to be different, talk about different talents that you have, your teamwork style, your leadership style, your character, etc. So the more diverse letters you get of people who know you well, the better. You technically get, I guess, up to 10 letters. I do not recommend doing 10 letters. I think average is like 4 to 6-ish, 4 to 7. I'll be perfectly honest, if I saw more than 6 or 7 letters, I stopped reading them because I was like, I don't got time for this. So try to make your letters count. And 5 to 6, I would say, is max. Maybe 7, unless things have changed. Choosing recommenders who do not know you personally. Choosing someone who taught you in a large lecture class. And choosing a professor from a class you did poorly in are all things that you don't want to do. Because the worst case scenario you can do for letters is get a letter from someone who's really unwilling to do it for you, but is like not nice enough to say no. So then they write it for you and they just copy paste someone else's letter. And then I find, oftentimes we get a lot of applications from the same school or the same professor. And I'm like, man, I just saw this format like 2 weeks ago, And you really don't want that to happen to you. So try to pick people who really care about you and know you. And I know it can be really difficult. So if you're seeing this and you're early in college, and especially like sophomore, junior, and you're thinking of applying the next 1 or 2 years, be really intentional. Like try to get to know people, try to get to know professors, spend that extra time because if you're attending a class of 500, it's really hard to get to know your professor. So. Bottom line, letters of recs are important components of the application because they offer objective, knowledgeable third-party views, and they fill the knowledge gap. And then we'll go into secondaries next. So secondaries are basically after you submit your AMCAS, you should pop a champagne bottle because you finished the first part. Good to you. Congrats to you. But number 2, then all the medical schools who are interested in you will send you a secondary application, sometimes within 5 minutes. So they often send it even without reading it. Sometimes they read your primary and then send it. There's a variety of different methods. But the secondaries are often additional essays that you have to write that they want for their school. Sometimes there's nothing. Sometimes they just want you to pay money and then you submit it, which kind of hurts. But they will ask sometimes the same information that AMCAS you already submitted, and then additional essay questions. So the rule with secondaries is you got to try to get them as soon as possible. These will pile up, and this will become your life for at least the next 3 months, from July, August to whenever you finish them. And they say you try to complete them within 2 weeks of receiving them. You'll find out if you apply to 30 schools, this becomes really impossible. But we still recommend as best as you can, try to submit a good copy of what you wrote as early as you can, because when your secondary application is submitted is when your application becomes complete and then reviewed. So until you submit that, it's just hanging as an incomplete application and no one's looking at it sometimes. So. And so another true or false, if I submitted my primary application on the first day the AMCAS opened, I will still have an advantage no matter when I turn in my secondaries. I think this one's a pretty easy one. Yep, thanks for the falses. Yep, so as I just said, I kind of gave away the answer, but you kind of have to complete the secondary to make sure your application is complete. So just because you got your primary application first day, it doesn't mean anything until you submit everything. So these are some common secondary prompts. You'll find that you'll be able to recycle or reuse a lot of the essays you wrote to redirect them to different questions, which is kind of nice. But at the end of the day, these are questions that you'll have to think about. So I recommend that you look at these questions ahead of time, start to draft responses so that you're not overwhelmed with the secondary start. Quick tips, read the secondaries carefully, paraphrase keywords, summarize what they want to do, and specify the technical guidelines of what they want. There's sometimes optional sections. That doesn't, usually that means they're really optional. You don't always have to complete them, at least as far as my experience was. But if you think something will be helpful, please feel free to write it in. And again, secondary material is fodder for interviews. So only write what you want to talk about, and write only things that are really significant experiences. You don't want something that's really superficial, and don't exaggerate. Lastly, the medical school interview, which is, to be honest, the most fun part once you get to this stage. So once you've done your primaries and your secondaries, you're going to have to wait time as little as 1 day to as much as, I think the longest I waited was 3 months to get an interview. And I got an interview after 3 months after submission. And once you get it, you're being seriously considered for acceptance, because at that point, your odds have improved from 1 in 50 to 1 in either, like, I don't know, 4 or 5, or you've basically improved dramatically in your chances of getting in. Applicants receive medical school interviews August to March, so as late as March, or I think sometimes even April, but really late, but the earlier the better, obviously. Interview formats to expect. There's a traditional interview that was mostly the majority of cases, but now also multiple mini interviews as well, and group interviews, which I've done as well. So the interview itself, common interview questions. Just before I go into this, interview itself is really a personal interview. It's not like a Wall Street interview that just fires questions at you and expects you to like problem solve your way through how many golf balls are in a plane. But it's really a personal interview to get to know who you are and why you want to do medicine, those 2 questions. And like, what is your character like, and how much can I trust you to become one of the people in our country who's going to be a doctor? And would I want you to become my doctor? These are the 2 questions. And the third question we always jokingly said is, would I want to introduce you to my family? And it's like, hey, do I like you? So those 3 questions are often the questions in my back of my head when I interviewed someone. So they're often, we want you to think about your career goals. What is your 10-year plan from now? We know no one has a solid plan, but we want you to at least think about it. It's definitely going to come up, why do you want to be a doctor? And this is the question you need to practice. Like, even if you got it down, you got to have a 1-minute version, a 2-minute version, a 5-minute version, a 10-minute version of how you're going to respond to that question. Because they may say, I want you to explain it in 3 sentences or less. And then you're going to be like, ah. So you got to really think about it, to soul search and think about this question. And a lot of us can help you with that question as well. But I think it requires a lot of time and thinking to get that question straight. Also, obviously, what do you bring to our school? A common question I ask is like, we're interviewing like 600 other people. Why should we accept you? So think about that question. And then there are other questions that they'll ask you, but the most important thing when you're going into the interview is try to remember the 6 most important things that are your talents that you've written about, and try to use them as fodder for responses. Like, someone asks you about, oh, what are you passionate about? Like, oh, let me tell you about this volunteering experience I did. So have them at the back of your head to use them as like sort of cannon fodder every time there's a bit opportunity. so that you can get all the important stuff across during the interview. So, and then these are some common questions that we ask. Some behavioral questions like teamwork skills, leadership skills, relationships, and they can be pretty personal. So feel free to be as personal as you want. Obviously, it's still a very professional setting. I can't emphasize that enough. Just because it's a student interviewing you, do not take it informally. Oftentimes, I've seen that backfire dramatically when they're like, "Oh, it's another guy like I can just hang out and shoot the shit with." But really, you got to be professional. There's a reason why you wear a suit and tie to these interviews. So. And multiple mini interviews are the other format. These are less personal but more rapid fire. The idea is that you do a lot more of these in succession, so it kind of gives you a better average of who you are. So they often give you like an ethical question, a prompt, often with no real correct answer, but they're more interested in your thought process. So then they ask you to talk aloud what you think. That kind of gets at your thinking skills, cultural skills, maturity, understanding of medicine, etc. So some sample MMI scenarios, we'll go over one of them, like, is it ethical for doctors to strike? If so, under what conditions? There's a lot of ethics, but there are other prompts as well where it involves, say a cultural moment where one culture patient is interacting with a different culture doctor. How do you navigate that, etc. So you can find a lot of these resources and with us and elsewhere to help you with MMIs. So MMIs, there are questions that may come up in any school's interview process. You can usually find out ahead of time if they do MMIs or traditional interviews, and that way you can prepare accordingly.
Okay, so now I'm just gonna jump back in here very quickly, just talk through like our results, our programs, and then we're gonna open it up for Q&A with Philip. So here's a look at some of our acceptances. We've had students get into schools like Harvard, Stanford, UCSF, Michigan, San Diego, and more. And then I'm just going to quickly outline our different programs. So first, we have our candidacy building program. This can start as early as your freshman year in college. With this, you would be paired with both a former admissions committee member and a graduate coach, and we would help with early planning and strategy. So thinking through your different gap year plans, thinking through what type of extracurricular activities you need to be involved in, thinking through like strategy for the MCAT, all of that type of stuff. And then we have application counseling. This is starting right now. I know that the old cycle is wrapping up, but it's always better to start earlier. Like Philip said, you have to make sure that your application is top notch and that you submit right when the AMCAS opens. So if you're applying this year, this would be the best program for you. With this, you would be paired with both a former admissions committee member and a graduate coach, and we would help you from start to finish building up your medical school applications. And then we also have interview prep. So this comes a little bit later in the cycle, from like September to March. If you get an interview and you feel like you need more help to prepare for it, then we help with strategy and mock interview with either a former admissions officer or a graduate coach. So if you're interested in learning more, you can email me at grace.kennedy@ingeniusprep.com, or you can sign up for a free consultation online where we can kind of just talk through your different strategies and I can help answer any questions that you may have. But yeah, so now we're going to open it up for Q&A with Philip. So you guys can use the question function or the chat box to ask any questions that you may have. But I'm just going to go a bit earlier in the chat box. People were asking a couple questions that I thought were good. Someone was asking, and I'm not sure if you already answered this, but are there specific admissions officers that are assigned to like your file? Is it split up via region or is it just totally random?
I think it completely depends on the medical school, but sometimes there is a rhyme or reason of how they're assigned. So like some admissions officers may be assigned for like some committees, because there are multiple committees as well usually. So some committees will deal with all applicants from a certain school so that we become familiar with, for instance, like I had all the Yale applicants, so I knew a lot about the New Haven homeless shelter. I knew a lot about so you become more aware of the program, so that it makes it easier for us to evaluate you better. So there is some process. I think there was a question of whether the admissions officer that's reviewing your file is also interviewing you, and that's not always the case. It can be the case, but oftentimes another member will be interviewing you and writing a report, and then I read that report and then present your file to the entire committee. I basically make a pitch like, so and so, like John Doe is here, he did so and so and blah blah blah. His interview was blah, so therefore I really think this guy should be accepted, or I think I'm kind of lukewarm about this guy, or we should never accept this guy, which I really would never say, but that's sort of the idea.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Okay, and then someone else asked here whether medical schools take into consideration the undergrad school that you attend. So if you're at a better undergrad, can you get a lower GPA and vice versa?
Yeah, so that it does matter, and the answer is yes and no. Yes, to a certain level. Like, we obviously see your school, we obviously see your major, we obviously sort of see your course load. So if you did a lot more courses, we see if you're in engineering or a science or whatever major, and kind of see your grade. But also we see your science GPA and total GPA. So we put that all together and make kind of a calculation in our head that is not AI based. But that being said, even if you're from Harvard, like a really low GPA from Harvard is still a really low GPA no matter what, So you have to keep in mind, just because you're at an Ivy League or elite school, or just doesn't mean you can just get away with bad grades, and vice versa. Just because you're top grades at a low school doesn't necessarily mean that that's always going to be like everything, because we do give weight on which colleges you attend as well. So, and none of that is like pre-assigned. It's not like I put 4 points for Yale and 3 points for Dartmouth, but it's sort of all sort of seen together holistically.
Okay, great. Okay, someone is asking here, like, what type of things can younger students do to prepare for medical school?
I see. I guess that's a long question. There are many things you can do. Most importantly, what I like to tell people is try to get as many experiences to see doctors and patients in action. So whether that's shadowing or volunteering, I can't speak how much it adds to your experience, not only to your application, but to your maturity and your who you are, by seeing doctors and us at work. Like, there's no replacement for that. You can read as many Atul Gawande books you want, but you've never seen a surgeon in action. It's not the same, right? So I can't emphasize how much to actually get in, try, use your contacts, use your parents' contacts, use your alumni network, use whatever you can get to get into the door, into the operating room, to the clinic, to the hospital, volunteer, whatever works best in your region, in your local area, to get those opportunities to see us in action. I think if you're early on in your college career or before you're applying, I think it's very important to be involved with doctors, really understand what we do. And, not all, there's so many medical fields. So I hate, for instance, dermatology. Like, I hate skin, but I love surgery. So just because you don't like one field, don't rule us out either. So.
Okay, got it. A lot of people here are asking about advantages versus disadvantages of gap years. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, advantage in this. So gap years, I think, can be very helpful. I think it's you can't really compare. Like, just because you take a gap year doesn't make you suddenly more amazing. But just because you can take a gap year doesn't mean suddenly you're less amazing. I think it depends on the personal circumstance. Some people, spend 5 years at Wall Street and then apply to medical school and have a pretty cool story. I went straight through, and I had my straight through story. So I think it all depends. But I think it's really important how you explain your gap years and what you did and what you've gained, especially if you've already applied once before. I think it's if you're applying again, it really have to show some change. So, but other than that, I think I definitely personally I encourage people to take gap years if that's on your mind, because I have many friends who did very well who took that gap year, and I'm all about taking breaks. I think I got an MBA during med school too, so enjoy life. It's a long journey in medicine. I'm looking at a 14-year training journey after college, so it's 18 years since high school of training to go through. So it's a long journey. There's no rush. Do what's best for you for your life experiences. So.
All right, got it. Okay, someone else was kind of asking, I think a lot of people actually were asking this, what if you come from a non-traditional background, such as majoring in a non-science, or maybe having to go back to a post-bac program, does that hurt you at all?
No, it's very common. Even when I was interviewing at Harvard Medical School for applicants, there were a significant number of applicants who did post-bacs. Sometimes because, most of the times because they didn't realize they want to were pre-med when they were in college and they had some life experience and realized that they want to become a doctor. So I think, and sometimes, people didn't have the pre-med requirements or et cetera. So, and, if the post-bac experience shows better grades or that you're fulfilling all the requirements, I think that helps. Obviously, we still see everything. So at the end of the day, we will see everything from your freshman year onward. And some schools even ask for every letter from every research experience as well. So you have to keep that in mind.
Okay, got it. Okay, and then someone else and a couple other people I think are asking about what if they were diagnosed with something themselves? Should they talk about their own medical journey, if they went through surgery or like had their own kind of healthcare system journey?
Yeah, I think if you had a pivotal moment, like for instance, one of my friends had a traumatic skiing accident, injured both his knees, had an incredible surgery experience that completely altered the way he thought about medicine and inspired him to become a doctor. And if that truly is your story, then by all means tell us, right? But obviously, if only write about it if it truly has an impact in your life. Just because your once removed uncle had a little skin tumor removed, and now you're suddenly inspired. You gotta make sure that it makes sense to your application theme. So write up only things that really matter to you.
Okay, got it. I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. Okay, some people were asking about how medical schools view special master's programs. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's similar to, I think it's similar to a lot of the things that after undergrad are seen not too differently. I think master's programs are also very common. Obviously, master's is a little more elevated than a post-bac, but we often, it all depends how it fits with your picture. So if you're doing a master's in public health and you're passionate about helping people through making a difference and changing policy or public health measures, I think it really helps. So it doesn't really matter where you are in your journey, as long as you can really convince us that medicine is the right calling for you. So.
Okay, great. And then someone else was also asking about what if you have poor grades? Do you need to explain them in your application?
Yes, yes. Especially if it was a one-off thing where, say, one semester you got a lot of C's, and then since then everything went well. It may help to write exactly what happened. Was there a death in the family? Did you have a tough relationship? Sometimes if you don't write anything, it raises more questions, and not all of us are going to probe and be like, what happened? Why'd you get this C? But it may, depending on what you say, it may hint to things that we don't want to hear. So almost sometimes may be better to come out straight about it. But obviously this is a very personal, person-to-person specific scenario. So I would get some advice before you write, what you do. So I don't want to give a blanket advice on this. So.
Okay, got it. Okay, and then let's see. Last question. Someone was asking about letters of recommendation. What if the person who's writing a letter of recommendation doesn't speak English well, or what if you don't know that many or aren't close with that many professors?
The English, well, I'm not 100% sure how to navigate that one. I don't know I don't think you can submit it in a foreign language, although that would be better. In terms of not knowing enough professors, that's a concern every pre-med faces initially. So you have to strategize. You have to think about who are the people you're going to ask this semester, and be open to people that you may not have expected. And who are the people going to know you well? There's obviously people that you have mentors that you know for sure, like those 2 people that know you well. They're going to be early letter writers, but it's getting the rest that can be tricky. So think about it ahead of time. Letters of rec, I always feel like pre-med advising programs should tell freshmen or sophomores early on to think about it, because if you think about it by the time it's May or June when the application is starting, it's kind of too late. And on that note, I think there's another question. If you've already finished your experience with that letter writer, ask them now. Don't wait till May or June, because they're going to forget about you after a semester, or at least forget specific experiences. So ask as early as you complete your relationship with them, so that they have that letter on file saved and ready for you to be given. So that's another tip.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions.
Sorry, a lot of questions.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions coming in. If you guys have any other questions or are interested in learning more about how we work with students, feel free to email me or sign up for a free consultation. Philip, thank you for taking time out of your very busy day to come with us tonight. And yeah, I hope everyone has a great rest of your night. Thanks, guys.
Pleasure to help.
Bye.
Thank you.